This is a small introduction. Brian was kind enough to let me show you 3 slides that I hope will put this into context. It's more timelines. And of course, you all know this was a drug developed in the 70s, and this is 2 of the very early papers from Campbell and Nomura, submitted in 1978. The patent filed in 77, and very early evidence on efficacy on filaria in veterinary diseases. And then just 1 year later, we have the first human paper as is in the Lancet in 1982. And then 87, we have the mectisantination program that started. In 98, expanded to include also LF. And then 2015 finds us with 2.7 billion doses distributed and a Nobel Prize. So from the beginning, the evidence of this having an insecticidal effect was there, and this is one of the early papers from the end of the 70s about tick control. Then the first mosquito trial was Pampillones in 1985. And then we had a 20-year period in which we saw more or less 1 paper every 3 years on this subject of killing mosquitoes with ivermectin. After that, it started to gain speed, and just from 2010 to 2014, we saw more or less 3 papers a year. And now, just in the last 2 years, we've had 18 papers, we have 3 clinical trials that finished, and now we have this symposium. So this seems to be gaining momentum. So in the face of this momentum and on the chicken and egg problem between drug developers and vector controllers, because it seems to be in the middle between both realms, the question arises, well, how can we use all this evidence that's being generated to inform or better inform policy? So what happened is that in WHO, the Global Malaria Program and the Neglected Tropical Disease Program joined efforts and convened a technical consultation to assess the evidence that was being generated and propose a target product profile. That was the outcome, and that happened in March, April this year, and it was presented to the Malaria Policy Advisory Committee just last September. And MPAC gave some advices, and the next step is that this is being re-reviewed according to their advice. And I think now it is our task to start generating evidence following their advices and to start regulatory discussions. Don't forget to include the pre-qualification scheme from WHO, and also start important discussions on supply and access. And that's just the context that I wanted to give. Thank you, Brian. And I want to welcome Brian Foy, who's going to give us some very interesting data.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm really excited to share with you the results prior to submission for publication of our Rindomol trial, a pilot cluster randomized trial, safety and efficacy trial. And this was a collaborative effort between my lab at Colorado State University and my excellent colleagues in southwestern Burkina Faso at the IRSS and the Centre Moraz in southwestern Burkina Faso. And especially with my co-principal investigator, Roch de Vire, and the rest of our colleagues that made this effort happen. So the impetus for our trial was many years of doing research in West Africa, in southeastern Senegal, northern Liberia, and more recently in Burkina Faso, where we've been following mass drug administrations of ivermectin that would occur in the rainy season for lymphatic filariasis or onchocerciasis control. And we would basically do bioassays where we'd follow the mass drug administration, and then we'd collect blood-fed mosquitoes in people's houses before and after the ivermectin was given, and measure their survival and other things, as well as compare it with treatment uncontrolled villages. And this graph generally was published in 2014 by our group, and it kind of summarizes all our data since that work. Basically, ivermectin in the bloodstream kills the mosquitoes when they bite treated people for a certain period of time. In the blue on the top graph, you can see the survival rate, 3-day survival rate of the mosquitoes. it holds relatively steady across the time period of sampling mosquitoes past when the mass drug administration is given at time 0 on the x-axis. But in the red, those are the treatment villages. And as soon as the mass drug administration is given, survival precipitously declines significantly, and it lasts for about a week. This is a mosquitocidal effect that basically shadows the time that mosquitocidal drug concentrations are present in villagers after the mass drug administration. What that effectively does is it put a pulse of insecticidal activity of blood meals through the population, which significantly impacts the mosquito population that are biting the villagers predominantly, the Anopheles gambis sensulata. And what this effectively does is it shifts the population structure for a period of time of about 2 weeks. And we can measure this in the middle graph with the parity rate. Young mosquitoes haven't lived long enough to bite an infectious person with gametocytes and then develop salivary gland sporozoites. And so this young population of mosquitoes has a drop in the sporozoite rate that we can see in the red on the bottom graph compared to blue in untreated villages. And this data was accumulated over many years of working in those countries that I talked about. And our coverages averaged around 75% of the mass drug administrations, and this was on top of bed net distributions. So you might say, well, that's a big deal. It's only a temporary effect. So we immediately were thinking, well, what if we give this out repeatedly? And that would fit very well with more often drug distributions of ivermectin to better control lymphatic filariasis and to achieve elimination. And so Hannah Slater at Imperial College was kind enough to model this for us, and she compared on the left 3 weekly dosing strategy over the rainy season in Burkina Faso compared to 2 weekly dosing on the right. The effect on the clinical incidence of malaria episodes in children under 5. And also was modeled the time to start the mass drug administration regimen relative to the beginning of the rainy season. And as you can see down here, oops, sorry, I did what you told us not to do. As you can see down here, the model clearly showed that we could have a strong effect against clinical incidence, a reduction about 38% if it was timed optimally and given every 3 weeks rather than every 2 weeks over the rainy season. And so we used this information to power our trial. And it was a cluster randomized trial, the cluster being the village, performed in southwestern Burkina Faso, right near the border of northwestern Ghana, in villages around the town of Dibougou. We asked 8 villages that were moderately to small size to participate, and they all agreed. And they were randomized and allocated in a public event, and then we proceeded enrolling them. This region is still endemic for lymphatic filariasis after many years of mass drug administration, so they decided to up the number of MDAs to 2 per year. And so we wrote on the back of that, and indeed the 2 arms, our intervention or control arm, do not diverge until the second MDA, which is ivermectin only, occurring only in intervention arm villages, as you can see. Sorry, again, I did that, down here. But ivermectin plus albendazole was given in mass drug administration to both villages in both arms on the first MDA, starting around July 20th. Our primary outcome was adverse events in children malaria episodes, incidents in children under 5 who were enrolled in each study village. That was our primary outcome, as you can see down here. We also recorded adverse events as a secondary outcome. And we did some sampling for parasitology and entomology, but I won't be talking about that today with you. So this is one of our nurses who's performing active case detection on the children. The children, the nurses were obligated to visit each child 3 times every 2 weeks over the course of the 18-week trial, where they measured fever or history of fever in the last 24 hours. If that was positive, they would administer a rapid diagnostic test. If that was also positive, they would immediately administer artemether lumefantrine. These nurses also passively asked, or we told the village populace to inform the nurses as they were doing their rounds whether any of them had an adverse event, as well as to be communicated about those from the community health workers in the village. The nurses, each nurse was assigned to a control and a treatment village, and they also worked with community health workers to distribute the ivermectin mass drug administrations for the trial. This is our participant flow chart, which is probably too small for you to read, but in general, every household except one in our villages enrolled in our trial, and pretty much every child in each village enrolled in our active case detection cohort. This shows you some of the demographics, the most important of which are that we did have more participants in our intervention arm villages. Sorry, keep pressing the wrong button. But the demographics of the arms were relatively well balanced. The exclusion criteria for mass drug administration of ivermectin is pregnancy, breastfeeding an infant less than 1 week of age, or height of less than 90 centimeters. So the top is all participants, and this is the ACD cohort, children under 5 that we enrolled in each of those villages. Importantly, you'll see that surprisingly, 22% of our children who were told by the parents that they were 5 years old were actually tall enough to be repeat treated with ivermectin. So we had 22% of those kids actually getting repeated ivermectin in the intervention village and once in the controls. And we'll get back to that in a little bit because that's a pretty interesting finding. So our MDA coverages were, as we would expect, they're pretty high on the first, and they kind of declined as we went down the trial. But nonetheless, we stayed above 70% the whole time, which was what we were trying to get to. This is our population age and sex distribution pyramid. And this is a kind of a unique trial from what you're normally used to thinking, because ivermectin covers these people. Of course, the pregnant women and the newly breastfeeding women are excluded, and the children who are too short are excluded too. But the group down here is who we're looking for our change in incidence. So Hannah will give a nice slide later on, but basically the idea, again, to reiterate, is that the mosquitoes have a high probability of biting any one of these people who's covered with ivermectin and dying before they ultimately can bite this group in the young age group that would suffer the effects of having exposure to parasites and therefore have a contract malaria episodes because of that. So I'm going to tell you about our secondary outcome first, which is adverse events. We had reason to believe that this should not induce any harms in the treatment in the treated patients. And this is from many years and many publications of frequently repeated treatment studies with ivermectin. Although most of these, at maximum, they did 155 patients, so we were going up to 2,000. So that was our big safety concern. But the good news is that our safety was very strong. There was no difference in the adverse events between the intervention arm and the treatment arm, with a risk ratio of 1.49 and not a significant p-value. Nor was there a difference in adverse events that were classified as severe adverse events or adverse reactions, or the differences in intensities, or the outcome of the event. This shows us the incidence of malaria episodes in cohort children over time over the intervention period. So our trial was 18 weeks. On the on the y-axis is the malaria incidence per person year for each of our children. Control arms are in black, intervention is in red. You can also see the rainfall in purple there, and the mass drug administrations are kind of delineated with the bars and at the top. So you would not expect the differences in our arms to diverge until after the second mass drug administration, because remember, the first, everybody got ivermectin plus albendazole, and on the second, only intervention arm villages received ivermectin alone, and then they received it repeatedly until the trial ended, up to six mass drug administrations. You can see the malaria incidence in general peaks over the rainy season until late September, and then it starts to tail off. It looks like most of our ivermectin effects were occurring when malaria season was waning, the difference between the intervention and control incidence there. Most importantly, our primary outcome. This is an intention treat analysis. This was a Poisson regression analysis The unadjusted incidence were not different very much from the adjusted incidences. The incidences were adjusted due to the clustering effects of household and village, and also for gender, which was significant. The incidence was significantly higher in boys compared to girls. But the incidence was 1.99 in the intervention arm, compared to 2.49 in the treatment arm, or the control arm, which was a risk ratio of 0.8, which was significantly different, a risk difference of negative 50%. Similarly, the time to first malaria episode in the cohort children was significantly delayed in their intervention arm. The median day was to begin onset of that first malaria episode was 47, day 47 of the trial, while in the control it was day 38. And this was a hazard ratio of 1.33, and this was significant. The classes of malaria episodes of all our children was between 0 and 7. Many of them had 0, and all the way, and some of them within 18 weeks had 7 episodes, which was amazing to me. But in general, in intervention arm, the number of the episode group frequencies shifted to the left. And with the strongest difference in those children that never received, never had a malaria episode in the intervention arm, which was 20%, compared to only 9% of those in the control arm. And this was significantly different. Now, going back to that group of kids that ended up being called less than 5 years of age by their parents, but they were actually tall enough, they were greater than 90 centimeters, so therefore they received ivermectin. We did a sub-analysis on them just only about a month ago, and I was very confused and excited to see these data. If you look at the last row, you will see that the malaria episode incidence in children 3 to 5 years of age, most of them were 4 to 5 actually, but a few of them were 3 in the control arm. These were given ivermectin, and so in the intervention arm, they're given ivermectin repeatedly, mostly between 4 and 6 times over the course of the trial. Their incidence was 1.29 per child, while in the control, these children would only get it that once in the first MDA in July. Their incidence was 2.29. with a risk ratio even higher than it was with taking all kids together, 0.56, and highly significant and a risk difference of negative 100%, which was really exciting and suggests a direct effect of ivermectin in repeat-treated children against malaria episodes, and unexpected. To put it another way, if you just look at the 3-year-olds, which is the light blue, there tend to be more of them in the higher episode classes. So here, while the 4 to 5-year-olds are in the strong colors, either divided into red, giving ivermectin repeatedly 4 to 6 times, and we're only looking at intervention arm kids now, compared to those who are 4 to 5-year-olds not tall enough, and therefore they didn't get ivermectin. In the group that never had a single episode, 60% of those kids got repeated ivermectin, while you'd expect it to be evenly divided. It is evenly divided in the episode frequency groups of 1 through 3, but then when you get to 4, only 20% of those got repeated ivermectin, while 80% of them did not, and none of them in the 5 episode group. So, very exciting, but unexpected, because all the previous data, which admittedly was very small, suggests ivermectin never has an effect against asexual stage parasites. But if this is true, it completely opens up the ability of ivermectin not to just control malaria transmission via the mosquito indirectly through mosquito deaths, which we show is significant, but also through direct effect. I was puzzled by this until I read a manuscript to review, and it pointed me to this paper, which really didn't talk about ivermectin all that much, but it was published in 2012, and they did a drug screen for drugs that were targeting exoerythrocytic stages in Plasmodium burgii, GFP expressing parasites. And ivermectin was not mentioned much. They actually mentioned their top hit, which was decoquinate, pretty much the whole paper. But ivermectin had a more significant effect even than primaquine at their doses in the mouse in terms of reducing liver load, as well as delaying blood stage parasitemia in the mice. So this could possibly be an effect that we actually stumbled upon in our clinical trial, if it can be proven. So the limitations are, this was a pilot trial, and therefore adjustments and sub-analyses were not planned a priori. It was also modestly funded. It was through the Bill and Melinda Gates Grand Explorations Challenge Program, and this is by no means to disparage that wonderful and awesome program that gave us money, but a lot of people told me I was crazy to try to do a clinical trial with $100,000 in a year. And it was very tough. We only could do 8 clusters. We had hoped to integrate new LLIN distributions to also reduce compoundly reduce LF transmission efforts. So most of our efforts were made towards the clinical and active case detection and relatively limited parasitological and entomological sampling. We needed to start the trial within 6 months of getting the funding, and it wasn't double-blinded, so there was no placebo. I was only blinded to the outcomes assessor. And finally, human and mosquito movement, human movement especially surprised me. There was a lot of it with young men moving in and out of the village. The motos were likely confounders to the trial. It's really hard to get very isolated villages. Nonetheless, our conclusions are that repeated ivermectin at 150 micrograms per kilogram every 3 weeks did not increase the harms of the participants. It significantly reduced uncomplicated malaria in children, and that converts to 500 episodes averted per 1,000 children over 18 weeks. There was the largest change in the subgroup of children who never suffered a malaria episode, 20% versus 9% in the control arm. The time of first malaria episode was significantly delayed in the intervention arm children. And finally, repeat ivermectin-treated children have an even lower incidence of malaria, which converts to 1,000 episodes averted per 1,000 children over 18 weeks. Thank you very much.